This plane has to be the holy grail of mixed bags. It has so many qualities that are both violently American and excruciatingly disappointing all at the same time, and it's both so old that it has to go and so critical that we can't get rid of it. And I had no idea that I'd make my take this long or that it would take this long to make. So I'm just gonna read my notes and let you be the judge. Today we're going to talk about the A-10 Thunderbolt II, aka the Warthog. This plane needs no introduction, but I'm gonna try and give it one anyways. This close air support monster is the grandson of the P-47 and effectively the child of the A-1 Skyraider and A-37 Dragonfly. And while the Soviets may have been the first to make an airplane that feels like something the orcs would use from Warhammer 40k, once America entered the chat, they would create one of the most controversial and iconic aircraft in history. This plane is the equivalent of a bardic odyssey. It almost looks mythical from all the stories that you've been told about it. But when you start to peek a little closer, it feels like you're looking down a kaleidoscope. It's a mix of patterns that just keep shifting, and the longer you look, the less you understand what you're looking at. So buckle up, because this video is going to be a ride and a half starting right from the get-go. And we gotta start with some background context, that being the mission it was made for, which originated from within the US Army and the doctrinal shift the Vietnam War brought about. It kinda goes without saying that the Vietnam War was kind of a mess for the infantry in the US Army. And after the war, the Army took the multitude of lessons they learned from that war and from the 1973 Arab-Israeli War to update the way they make the Army machine tear down the bad guys. Primarily, they realized there were limitations to the air mobile infantry strategy, aka transporting troops in by helicopter, that had been used up to that point. And these limitations were evident in every level of tactical command, from units as small as a corps to as large as a company. See, in Vietnam, the Army had operated by forcing the terrain into a shape that suited them so they could operate conventionally. They had never really considered using the terrain to their advantage for camouflage and safer movement, or thought about the strengths and limitations of their available weapon systems versus the ones they could fight.
He's a man of focus.
There were also the advances in new weapons such as anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, and the use of combined arms to project power in a given direction. Basically, the Army realized they were fighting a conventional war using conventional tactics and only adding new technology. They hadn't considered how they could adapt to terrain and enemy tech and how enemies could combine the two against them. And to make any of this strategy matter, the US had to make the round peg fit in the square hole that was beating their primary threat, a potential Soviet invasion in Western Europe. In this combat scenario, the Soviets would have everything the North Vietnamese had and more, which would include comparable technology, a likely metric ton of tanks, and a general numbers advantage in pretty much every aspect. The Army expected that weapons would increase in lethality as well, to such an extent that in any future war, troops could be wiped out in very little time if they weren't deployed effectively. The standard American operating procedure of winning battles with mass production and sheer numbers adding up over time wouldn't work, and an entire war might not be a war so much as a single giant battle. That means, in the absolute worst of circumstances, the Army would only win in Western Europe if they could immediately fight an entire war in a single battle against a technologically equal and numerically and materially superior opponent.
Oh, we're definitely gonna die.
Now, the Army did have a whole slew of nuclear-tipped weapons they could just blow them all up with, like Atomic Annie, the nuclear howitzer, the Davy Crockett Nukezooka, and a couple of other things. But they couldn't use them or train on them without approval from the Commander-in-Chief, aka the President. Not to mention outright irradiating the countries they were trying to defend just isn't going to earn you any brownie points. So after doing their homework, the Army decided that the best way to fight that single battle war was by prioritizing rapid assembly of defenses and just as quick counterattacks. This kind of strategy would rely on using longer range and precision weapons, advantageous use of terrain, logistics and supply systems stationed closer to the front, and highly mobile reinforcements and responses to control an entire battlefield the size of a war in minutes instead of months. This new practice became known as the air-land battle doctrine, where air and land systems would combine to react to a sudden war by snapping into action and repelling, delaying, or destroying as much of the enemy force as possible in a single long battle. And one of the elements they would need for that kind of quick reaction to enemy forces was the Close Air Support Mission Set, or CAS. Now, after 1947, the CAS mission was a core part of the Air Force's responsibilities instead of the Army's. At least it was supposed to be. Because by the early 1960s, they didn't have anything purpose-built for that job at all. The Air-Land Doctrine may not have been published until 1976, but the Army had been aware of both the Air Force's lack of close air support solutions and their lack of willingness to change that since 1964. This was early in the Vietnam War, and the Air Force was still egocentrically focused on things like getting the F-4D and the AIM-4D Falcon missiles into service, the second of which would eventually prove to be one of the most ineffective aerial weapons of the war. With the Chair Force really earning their nickname with this one, the Army went,
Fine, I'll do it myself.
And on November 3rd, 1965, they announced the desire to acquire the AH-56 Cheyenne attack helicopters to fill the close air support and anti-tank support roles. The Air Force, still going through their spoiled rich kid phase and wanting to do things their way and get all the attention while they were at it, they took this as a challenge to, well, do the job they were created for in the first place, and decided they wanted their own attack aircraft. The Air Force started by adopting the A-1 Sky Raiders as a stopgap measure to do God's work on the CAS gap towards the beginning of the Vietnam War. But it was fairly slow, and while its durability and loiter time were ideal for this mission, the slow speed made it an easy target. Combine that with the ego factor and not wanting to rely on a naval plane, and the Air Force decided to start the AX program in mid-1966, putting Colonel Avery Kay in charge and requesting design proposals in March of 1967. And for what seems like the first time since the B-52, the Air Force actually specified that they wanted something that followed the KISS principle. You know, keep it simple, stupid. Because simple is easier to fix. But it was also because the Air Force was struggling to get the ever more costly FX program off the ground that brought about the F-15, and that was eating up all the funding. So the AX had to be cheap, and the Air Force even specified to manufacturers that cost limits were more important than performance limits.
Cheap, cheap, cheap.
But remember, the new AX program would also have to take out those Soviet armor columns in a Cold War invasion scenario, and those armor columns would most likely be protected by self-propelled anti-aircraft guns like the ZSU-23 Shilkas. Basically, they'd have to defend against an invasion that would be dominated by tanks and supported by AA guns and missiles. And with all the technology coming online at the time, you'd think they'd want to rely on bombs or rockets or maybe guided munitions. Nope. For whatever reason, the Air Force decided the best solution for curing tank cancer was a gun. Now, the obvious answer as to why they would even think of that is because this is America, and when it comes to guns and blowing stuff up, the answer is always, it hasn't been done yet.
I'm spooning a Barrett 50 cal. I could kill a building.
There may have also been some influence from a handful of cases of Israeli Mirages using their 30mm cannons to punch through the thin roofs of enemy tanks. But the primary reason was that early in the AX program, a study dictated that a gun would be the most cost-effective weapon for the CAS mission, and it was expected that target identification would be a lot harder in a close-in frontline fight where the blue forces and red forces start looking a little purple. To actually distinguish friend from foe in that environment without significant advances in information processing, this would put a CAS plane low down over the field and inside of a range where air-to-surface missiles wouldn't give you much more than the gun would. So to both take care of CAS and take the Soviet tankers to class, the Air Force upgraded their requirement for the M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon to a new gun, a 30mm cannon called the GAU-8, which was first requested in 1970 with a required fire rate of 4,000 rounds per minute.
That's a lot of...
They also wanted it to be survivable, via both armor and systems redundancy, as well as highly maneuverable so it could fly at low altitudes even if there was bad weather or low-hanging clouds. Desired performance metrics included a top speed of 400 to 465 miles per hour or 650 to 750 kilometers per hour, a max takeoff run of 4,000 feet or 1,200 meters, and carrying 9,500 pounds or 4,300 kilos of mystifying surprises to an enemy up to 285 miles or 460 kilometers away, and sticking around to assert its 30mm dominance as required for up to 2 hours, or drop guided and unguided ordnance from more than 10 hardpoints. After Cessna, Fairchild, Boeing, Vertol, Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Northrop had all submitted proposals by August 10, 1970, the Air Force would later announce Fairchild and Northrop as the finalists. They would then award them just over $70 million in development contracts, which Republic actually got more of by promising that their final result would be closer to production standards. But the GAU-8 gun wouldn't be ready until later, so any and all prototypes would have to be flown with M61 Vulcans and retrofitted with GAU-8s later. And somewhere in here, Colonel K decided it would be a brilliant freaking idea to enlist one of the founding members of the infamous fighter mafia, and arguably the biggest moron of the bunch, Pierre Sprey.
Look, the man's an ass bucket.
If you're hearing about this man for the first time, Pierre Sprey is the kind of guy who likes to keep things so simple they border on the insane. This man would pick up a rock and call it a fighter plane because he can take out a plane with it if he could throw it hard enough. He was against the use of technology in military aircraft to the point that the radar and even the radio were wastes of weight and money. This guy genuinely demanded that America should go into Desert Storm using M48 Patton tanks from Vietnam instead of the M1 Abrams, and became probably the single largest source of misinformation on the F-35 after the Russians brought him in to talk smack about it on the air. He wouldn't allow either Fairchild or Northrop to use any form of computer simulation to get their testing done. In order to run wind tunnel tests, both companies had to put full-size models in outdoor wind tunnels for testing rather than using scale models, and he would have both companies test the durability of their aircraft by shooting them with live Russian weapons they bought on the black market. Don't get me wrong, the dedication is impressive, but this man still belongs in a frickin' asylum.
Someone ought to put you in a mental hospital.
Someone should put you in a box floating down the river, Grandma!
But regardless of what information you might find, the only primary source that actually says he had a, quote, instrumental role in the A-10's design process was either his own autobiography or the words out of his own mouth. And considering some of the stuff the Air Force had to bolt on later to actually make the A-10 usable, I wouldn't be surprised, because some of these decisions were too stupid to have been thought of by anybody else. A certain chubby Electron guy said in his video that whoever made this plane must have been a grunt with an engineering degree and a pile of cocaine, which is probably the most accurate summary of Sprey I can think of, because as you're about to learn, he was probably smoking something. But for right now, he kind of turns into a background character, so we're just gonna throw him away for the time being and fish him out of the trash again later, because by late 1972 and early 1973, the YA-9 and YA-10 were finally going head-to-head in their fly-offs. And by July 18, 1973, the YA-10 was chosen to become America's beloved Burt gun. Now, there were some political motives to help keep the ailing Republic division of Fairchild in the New York area from going under, but the A-10 did have a few things going for it. While it wasn't as maneuverable as the YA-9, the YA-10 was easier to maintain and deemed more survivable. But the biggest reason the Air Force went with the YA-10 was that the lower wing made it faster to reload the bombs and whatever else, and it was also more prepared for mass production, meaning it would take less time to put it on the assembly line and thus less money. 10 prototypes were ordered, however, this was later reduced to 6 as Congress was still not convinced that the A-10 would actually be useful or even necessary. But that doesn't mean the program wouldn't make headway, because by June of 1973, General Electric was selected to produce the GAU-8A Avenger cannon, and in the following months, Major Michael Major would propose the A-10 be given its now infamous nickname, the Warthog. The Hog would encounter some resistance in September of 1973 when the Air Force requested congressional approval for continued funding of its program, because Congress would only give its approval on one condition. It had to be tested extensively against the A-7D Corsair II deep strike bombers the U.S. Air Force had adopted from the Navy in December of 1968, the first time they tried replacing the Sky Raiders. Obviously, the A-10 won, especially when it showed off its ability to keep going in the battlefield for its required 2 hours, while the A-7 couldn't even last 8 minutes.
So, we're just done with phrasing, right? That's not a thing anymore?
Naturally impressed by the A-10's endurance, Congress would greenlight the construction of 4 pre-production models and 48 production A-10As in July of 1974. Later that year, the first pre-production A-10 was assembled, and after some ground tests, it was shipped on a C-5 before being reassembled for its first flight on February 15, 1975. The first production A-10 would be manufactured later that year, and the last would be made in 1984, with the C model to follow on in the late 2000s. And this is where the A-10 story really began. And of course, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the gun. The GAU-8A Avenger 7-barrel 30mm Gatling autocannon. This giant f***off gun is bigger than some cars and loads up a maximum of 1,174 30 by 173mm rounds. That is so much mass that the gun itself weighs over 2 tons when fully loaded. And believe it or not, even the A-10 wasn't fully prepared for this gun to be installed, because the Warthog was actually found to be slightly overweight when they shoved this thing into a prototype for the first time. But it's not like it can't get rid of that weight in a hurry. In fact, several hurries. This gun is like Alucard. It has restraint levels. There's a lot of debate over what its default fire rate is, but I do know it can be changed, which allows it to be toned down from its maximum of 4,200 rounds per minute to 3,900, 3,600, or even 2,100 for testing purposes. And since the pilot literally sits on top of the gun, that fire rate will definitely give you a massage right in the down under. In the words of U.S. Air Force Colonel John Lieberherr, quote, "The GAU-8 is a mechanical marvel, and shooting it is about the most fun one can have and keep your clothes on."
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
And since a gun that powerful is kind of an offense to the laws of nature and God, the entire plane literally had to be reshaped around it. The nose wheel landing gear had to be shifted to one side, the spent brass has to be kept in the airplane to make sure it can still fly when you're done mag dumping the latest offense to your terrain features, and the gun is angled slightly downward to minimize the impact of that recoil on the flight controls. Because that gun produces a lot of recoil, 10,000 pounds or 44.5 kilonewtons to be exact. For reference, the twin TF-34 turbofan engines the A-10 has put out 9,000 pounds or 41 kilonewtons of thrust each. The A-10's gun puts out more thrust than either of the engines, which slows it down and forces the plane to only fire in short bursts. But it does not put out more thrust than both of them, so the notion that it'll eventually start flying backwards if the gun could fire long enough is unfortunately kind of a myth. Busted! The Avenger cannon fires 3 types of rounds: high explosive incendiary rounds, practice rounds, which are just used for practice, and armor-piercing rounds made from depleted uranium. Why are we firing diet nuclear bullets that can pierce 2 to 3 inches of steel out of a Gatling gun? Well, uranium is more dense than a motherfucker, which means that a round made of uranium will go through more armor. It also pierces the armor in such a way that it actually gets sharper the further it punches in, which the denser element of tungsten used in the Russian and Chinese armor-piercing tank shells don't do. But that's not the only thing, because the old nuke-tip bullets are known as what's called a pyrophoric penetrator. See, these radiation-flavored rounds aren't made of only uranium. They have an aluminum casing on them. Why is that? Because uranium will straight up burn if the air touches it, meaning that not only will this round punch through your armor, the second it hits said armor, it will literally catch fire off of your local section of atmosphere and burn through both the rest of your tank and the rest of you.
Scheiße.
Now, all that probably sounds like borderline Earth magic, so somebody's probably wondering how effective those rounds actually are. And for some reason, so was the Navy. On November 7th, 1979, a firing study was conducted under the supervision of the A-10 Program Office by the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, where a Warthog was allowed to shoot at a simulated Soviet tank company. This company was actually made from M47 Patent II tanks, the predecessor to those M48s Spray wanted to send to Iraq. There were 10 Patent IIs in shoulder-to-shoulder elements of 3 with a single one out to the side, spaced a few hundred meters apart in a standard Soviet formation. In 10 unobstructed attack runs on the right side of each tank, the pilot fired between 11 and 27 rounds into each tank for 174 rounds total at 2,100 rounds per minute, scoring just over a 52% hit rate with 90 rounds, but only an 18% penetration rate with 30 rounds. 3 tanks were deemed catastrophically killed, which is an immediate fire or detonation of fuel or ammo. 1 was both mobility killed and firepower killed, aka couldn't move, couldn't shoot, and 3 more were mobility killed only, which is a total of 7 tanks rendered at a minimum somewhat inoperable, and 1 of them taking part in the turret toss along the way. And that's with half the max fire rate for the sake of testing and about 1/10 of the total ammo pool.
And I know when someone's holding back!
There is one thing about that study that bothers me, but we're gonna table that for later because I'm not done talking about all the death this thing can carry yet. The A-10 can take off weighing a maximum of 50,600 pounds or 22,950 kilograms, and its balls of hatred are mounted up under no fewer than 11 hardpoints. Although because of the arrangement of the 3 belly pylons, you could use either the center line or the 2 next to it, but not all 3 at once. These hardpoints can carry triple racks of its specialty Maverick missiles along with dumb bombs, dragfin bombs, rockets, other precision-guided munitions of the laser and GPS varieties guided by lightning and sniper targeting pods, jamming pods for self-defense, and aim-9 sidewinders for self-offense. It can even roll out with a pair of 20mm Vulcan gun pods, in case the 30mm death laser wasn't enough DACA for you. And on the late model A-10s, they would also be able to deliver all those mystifying surprises with a ballistic computer, plus a helmet-mounted queuing system for the heat-seeking sidewinders on the later A-10Cs. And speaking of heat, the A-10 gets moving by way of a pair of large bypass General Electric TF34 turbofan engines. Quick rundown of what large bypass means: turbofan engines have two sections, the core and the bypass. The core is the part of the engine where the air gets lit on fire, and the bypass is the part of the engine where the fan pushes air around the core for cooling and additional thrust without burning fuel. Basically, the core section is the splash zone, and the bypass is the rest of the bleachers, except you're using fire instead of water. And because of how big they are, supersonic speed isn't going to be on the table for any plane using it. Good thing they were going for low and slow. But the other neat thing about using a large bypass turbofan is the bypass section basically turns into spaced armor and eats bullets for all the important bits in the core. And that's if they even got hit in the first place, because they were specifically shoved into a position where it would be as hard as possible to lose them, on top of the plane and between the wings and tail. The wings help shield them from ground fire on approach, and the tail helps shield them from fire on the way out if they didn't shred it first. Plus, it partially protects the hot exhaust against heat-seeking missiles. Then the high mounting helps to reduce the amount of ingested dust and foreign object damage. The engine starters are even set up to fire continuously when the 30mm chainsaw is running, so if the gun exhaust gets in the engine and flames it out, it will automatically restart itself. And it isn't just the engine placement that makes the A-10 a flying final boss, because guess what? The A-10 is like 4 more health bars.
You killed one of me, but did you kill all of me?
One of them is the literal 1.5-inch thick titanium alloy bathtub surrounding the cockpit that is custom made to stop the 23mm armor-piercing rounds flying out of those Soviet AA guns. It has self-sealing fuel tanks to stop up any gas leaks. And then we get to the A-10's favorite R word, redundancy. The Hog can make it home with one engine, half a wing, and a vertical tail missing, has 3 sets of controls, 2 hydraulic and 1 manual, and 3 spare power systems, 2 batteries, and an auxiliary power unit, which is a mini jet engine that supplies air to the big engines to start them without any external equipment, which is exactly what you need to get your airplane running in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. And since an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, the A-10 also only partially retracts the landing gear if it has to make a belly landing, and it comes stock with more countermeasures than what's allowed by the laws of physics. 480 units of chaff and flares made from 16 blocks of 40 set up in groups of 4, 2 on the wingtips, 2 on the landing gear housings. The ones on the landing gear housing, which are noticeably right under the engines, carry flares, and the ones on the wingtips carry chaff, where the wingtip vortices can distribute them to the sky like the A-10's gun distributes freedom seeds.
To places that definitely never asked for.
And speaking of wingtips, the A-10's downturned wingtips have been the source of a lot of internet discussion, so I gave them some extra attention. The downturned wingtips are relatively interchangeably referred to as finch tips, Herner tips, or lippish ears. Not only do they reduce the strength of wingtip vortices slightly, which reduces drag and improves fuel economy, but they also act almost like fences that bracket some of the airflow under the wings and prevent it from escaping. This basically creates a Temu version of ground effect and adds a little extra lift towards the wingtips, and it appears to be really helpful at takeoff and landing speeds, but not ideal for any aircraft that wants to push around the sound barrier. Combine this with the A-10's thicker straight wing and a wing loading of only 40 pounds per square foot, or 200 kilograms per square meter, which is lighter than the F-16, and the A-10 can get off the ground in as little as 1,250 feet or as much as 4,000 feet with a full load. To put that into perspective, the FAA runway length requirement for an aircraft weighing a maximum of between 12,500 and 60,000 pounds is somewhere around the 8,000 foot mark, and the A-10 only needs half of that to get in the air when it wants to drag all of its Tanuki-sized nutsack over the enemy's face. But this design has got to have a weakness somewhere, and as you might expect from a program influenced by somebody as anti-tech as Spray, it is in the avionics department that his lack of foresight finally shows through. Some sources suggest that the only things in the cockpit that would have been unfamiliar to a Korean War-era Thunderjet pilot were the 2 TV screens in the cockpit. Everything the A-10 actually needed to fly in an era of information warfare had to be added after the fact.
We're not cavemen! We have technology!
Warthog pilots originally only had their Mark I eyeballs for navigation, but that didn't work out very well for flying at low altitude, so they had to bolt on a TACAN system, which was still line of sight only and complete garbage for low altitude flights, so then they had to replace it with an inertial navigation system for the last 281 A-10As just to make sure pilots didn't have to figure out which way was up on a map strapped to their legs at 400 miles an hour. Oh, and they also had to replace the mechanical pressure altimeter with a radar altimeter so they could actually find their way around the hills of Germany when the weather wasn't completely clear, because this ancient asshole who says he respects soldiers but has never put himself in their shoes for a day in his life has, to no one's surprise, not a single goddamn clue that soldiers don't call for a peace treaty every single time the sky opens up.
The last thing I'm gonna do is start crying for you now. Water makes him useless.
This man didn't even add a radio to the A-10 in the first place. He straight up said, yeah, give me the fuck off 4,000-pound gun that can cut some tanks in half for my attack plane, but don't you dare ask me about the maybe 10-pound radio system that'll tell me where I'm supposed to point the damn thing. I swear this man straight up wanted to be a friendly fire hazard, and I think he got his wish. Even the ability to carry guided munitions wasn't originally accounted for. The Pave Penny laser spot tracker for receiving laser designations for guided bombs, not designating them, receiving only, wasn't added on until after 1978 as a retrofit, and even then it looks like it just got bolted onto the side by the E4 Mafia. GPS guidance wasn't added at first either, but that's mostly because it just hadn't been invented yet, and somewhere along the line after Desert Storm, it would finally get that ballistic aiming computer for the guns. And speaking of Desert Storm, it's time to look at how the A-10 did in the most hotly contested environment it has ever seen combat in. And we'll start from the beginning. The first 48 Warthogs showed up in theater on August 15, 1990, only 2 weeks after Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait as part of the initial reinforcement of Saudi Arabia known as Desert Shield. These were followed by 48 more on August 29th, 18 more on December 27th, and then another 18 in early January of 91. 12 Forward Air Controller or FACO A-10A variants would also arrive between November of 1990 and January of 1991. All told, 144 A-10 variants were present in theater when the operation started on January 17th, and they would fly 294 sorties on the first day. These A-10s would go on to fly 8,100 sorties in total, and it is widely estimated by government sources that these sortie numbers were undercounted, giving them the highest sortie rate of the war and flying a minimum average of 1.4 sorties a day. And with exposure rates like that, you can bet they were taking shots from all around the theater. Ow. As many as 70 A-10s were damaged during the war, 20 of which saw what was classified as severe damage. Pause. 70 A-10s. Barring the aircraft that were lost, that is more than half of the A-10 fleet that went home with a Purple Heart. And out of all those planes, all but one of them were not only repaired, but repaired in the active theater of war. And half of those were back up and swinging again in less than 4 hours. And some of those A-10s came back with some nasty cases of bullet fever. One landed without an engine, another straight up chowed down on over 300 rounds and shrapnel fragments, and several more came back from missile hits that took out one or more layers of controls. But despite all the battle damage experienced, the A-10 fleet maintained a readiness rate of between 93 and 97% throughout the entire conflict. And those A-10s lost didn't make up an overly significant portion of US losses either. Of the 40 total US aircraft losses of the campaign, only 6 A-10s were lost in total. One went down to AAA fire, 2 to heat-seeking surface-to-air missiles, 2 to SA-13 radar-guided missiles, and that 6th one was that one time an A-10 was written off from battle damage.
Another happy landing.
And when I said before that the A-10 was involved from day one of the operation, I don't mean day one of the ground invasion. This thing was taking on missions right alongside the strike aircraft from the start of the air war. The A-10s were added to the list of anti-artillery battlefield air interdiction missions that were typically reserved for F-15Es and F-111s right within the first few days, and even a night attack on early warning radars and a command and control facility deep within Iraq that earned them the nickname, jokingly, of the Wart Weasels. It didn't even take 2 days into the conflict for senior officials to start changing their views on the gun with wings. By the 19th of January 1991, one of the A-10's biggest critics, that being the Theater Air Force Chief Lieutenant General Charles Chuck Horner, said in a press release, quote, "I take back all the bad things I have ever said about the A-10. I love them. They're saving our asses." Then once the ground operations started, the A-10s would rotate back to the CAS missions they were made for, which was and still is its strongest suit. However, some Air Force officials were not convinced, so they still attempted to replace the A-10s mid-operation with modified F-16s slinging a downsized 4-barrel version of the 30mm gun called the GAL-13A mounted in a pod under the fuselage. And as you might have expected, this failed, because the F-16's airframe wasn't designed to carry a gun that powerful and couldn't place its shots accurately.
That ain't no normal hardware, big man. That shit got a V8.
God, even like pull it all the way down.
But it's not like the A-10 didn't give some people reasons not to be convinced of its performance. It had a lot of problems and several question marks left over with its performance at the end. Yes, the A-10 may have launched 90% of the nearly 5,300 Maverick missiles fired during the whole war, and more guided munitions than any other aircraft type, but only 8% of all munitions fired off during Desert Storm were guided at all. The remaining 92% of bombs dropped were the old-fashioned unguided warheads on that General Zip Code's foreheads. Now, you could make the argument that the A-10 fired more precision munitions because it was more typically used against tanks and vehicles more often, typically called point targets. But while some in-theater commanders reported an 85% effective combat sortie rate, when the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, not to be confused with GAU, reflected on weapons system performance to cross-check manufacturer claims with real battlefield data, they couldn't actually nail down the A-10's engagement success rate even 5 years after the war was over. It was noted that a lot of its engagement data was either unclear or contradictory, probably since battlefield damage assessments, or BDAs, were typically only performed after targets had been struck multiple times, so it was never clear how much damage the A-10 actually did.
Already dead.
More to that point, during Desert Storm, the US only ran a BDA on 357 of the 856 strategic targets that strike data was even available for. But what I find kind of odd, though, is that it was the only aircraft where there was no available data regarding successful engagements. At least not aside from 2 helicopter kills marking the A-10's first air-to-air victories, first on February 6th and then again later on February 15th, which would also prove to be the last air-to-air gun kill by US forces on record. And considering the pilot's testimony, I'm surprised the pilots didn't nickname the bullets from this thing the Magic Erasers, because they made those helos disappear.
And for my next trick.
However, even during the account where a pair of Warthogs beat up on 23 tanks in a single day, Hog pilots would rely on their 6 Maverick missiles for tank kills way more than they did their guns. There were probably a couple of reasons for this, one of those being that the A-10s in service, the original A-10As, didn't have the ballistic computer for the guns yet. So in order to shoot somebody with the cannon, you basically had to be a sniper from 2,000 to 3,000 feet away with an anti-tank Gatling gun that's actively trying to doomslayer its way out of your airplane. There was also the fact that at some point during the war, the A-10s also started fighting at night. Probably, if I had to guess, because of the amount of damage they were taking during the day. In the words of 354th Tactical Fighter Wing Commander Colonel Sandy Sharp, who asked for the 355th Tactical Fighter Squadron, the Falcons, to be trained for night ops, quote, "If they can't see you, they can't shoot you." And during this training, they also learned that you couldn't actually hear the Hogs coming in if they were more than 5,000 feet off the ground. So they added night fighting to the list, and the A-10s would end up going on more missions at night than the F-117 Nighthawk. And here's the kicker, right? The only A-10s in service at that point in time were the A-10As, remember? Night vision goggles weren't added to the A-10s until the A-10Cs, and those wouldn't reach initial operating capability until 2007. These A-model Hog pilots were flying around at night in an active war zone without night vision. Those pilots were World War IIing that shit using nothing but their Mark I eyeballs, their instruments, aerial flares, and the infrared TV displays for their heat-seeking Maverick missiles to figure out where the hell they were going and where they were shooting. They would walk out to the flight line with tape on their helmets or homemade cardboard cutouts that they would use to cover up some of their instruments and place around the cockpit to reduce light and reflection so they could preserve night vision. vision. They would even take off their fire-resistant gloves so they could identify the cockpit switches by feel, and photocopied black and white maps that were easier to read at night. It's not just the Warthog that's function over form, even the pilots are in on the act. This is a special kind of gangster, and unfortunately, like a lot of other cases, it stems from the fact that the equipment they were using was not made for the task at hand. And while they could aim the Mavericks at night, it was a lot harder to aim the gun through a TV screen off to one side that was a few inches by a few inches at 5,000 feet off the ground. So it's really no surprise the gun probably wasn't as well used as the Maverick against tanks.
I can't see a thing.
Oh no, what a nightmare.
Sorry.
But there were other and more apparent limitations to the Warthog as well. For one thing, it pretty much required the use of forward air bases to get the most out of its performance, which isn't out of its wheelhouse at all, and it's literally its job, but that also means its 2-hour loiter time is a lot more subjective than it might sound on paper. The A-10 can only hang around as needed for 2 hours when it's a maximum of 290 miles or 465 kilometers away from the target. The A-10 does have a max ferry range as far out as 2,580 miles or 4,150 kilometers with drop tanks equipped, but that is a one-way range and done without any weapons loaded up, meaning that at maximum it can reach a target roughly about 1,200 miles away with drop tanks on and weapons loaded, and then it can only stick around for a few seconds before turning around, same as any other fighter jet. This does give it the longest range for an American aircraft of its size, which would make it much more ideal for deep strikes if it weren't for another issue: its speed. There's a reason that some pilots like to joke that the A-10 is a single-engine plane with half an engine on each side. This thing is so slow. It's supposed to be, because that helps it put lead on target when something needs to die, but the Thunderbolt II's max speed is only about 425 miles an hour or 680 kph. That puts it in the same speed ballpark as the World War II era Thunderbolt I. That speed made it pretty easy to shoot at, and as you might have guessed, 70 aircraft getting shot at and hit is by and away the largest number in the conflict, bar none. Even reducing it to just critical damage, the A-10 was still the most struck American aircraft of the conflict. And while most of them did come home, the only thing better than getting shot and walking it off is not getting shot in the first place. And theoretically, that's the benefit the A-10 is supposed to provide to the people it covers. Supposed to being the operative phrase.
Oh boy, I sure am excited to see my family again.
The A-10 would cause numerous documented friendly fire incidents during its time in combat, whether that be in Desert Storm, Operation Allied Force over Kosovo, and the global War on Terror. In one Desert Storm incident, an A-10 fired a Maverick missile on an Iraqi target, which apparently lost lock and reacquired a Marine Corps armored fighting vehicle, killing 7 Marines and injuring 7 more. The worst one of Desert Storm was on February 26, 1991 during the Battle of 73 Eastings, when an A-10 element was called in to strike Iraqi armor units. However, the A-10s misidentified a column of 37 British Warrior infantry fighting vehicles as Iraqi units, and turned their Mavericks loose on them, killing 9 Brits and injuring 11 more. Then there was March 23, 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom and the global War on Terror. An A-10 element fired on a company of Marines engaging the enemy in An-Nasiriyah, Iraq, with 1 out of the 18 Marines killed lost due to friendly fire, 7 to enemy fire, and the other 10 remaining unconfirmed due to the heavy fighting. Only 5 days later, on the 28th of March, another A-10 element would misidentify another British vehicle column as hostile and fire on them, resulting in 2 destroyed Scimitar light tanks, a damaged Spartan armored personnel carrier, 1 dead and 4 injured. It's reported that between 2001 and 2015, the A-10 killed 10 US troops in 4 different friendly fire incidents and roughly 35 Afghan civilians since 2010. But while this commonly seems to be blamed on the A-10's gun being inaccurate, all cases so far seem to point to the pilots shooting exactly where they thought they had to. The actual source of these incidents, at least in those reports I was able to find, was an over-reliance on the pilot to correctly identify targets combined with communication issues resulting from personal error and/or outdated technology.
No, not me!
There was even a case of a cow getting his dome taken off. The Air Force report said that it was taken out as a result of ordnance, but I'm pretty sure the A-10's explosive 30mm rounds count as ordnance. Every living thing in the region would learn to fear the A-10, to the point that even its enemies would take cover when they came by. There are so many reports of the A-10 being fantastic as a cast platform for infantry, it's hard to count them all. But a reputation it probably should not have is the one that came with the nickname of Tank Buster. Of course, yet again, Pierre Sprey was responsible for this nickname and the associated idea that the A-10's gun alone made it an anti-tank menace. And while the A-10 absolutely did take out tanks with its gun, it is not the god-tier end-all be-all to armor he made it out to be. Not only did the F-111 Aardvark take out more tanks than the A-10 did overall, but the Avenger cannon, being the complete antithesis of tanks, isn't even accurate, because it couldn't even penetrate the front of Soviet tanks that came online the year it entered service, let alone after that. During the prototyping trials, the Avenger cannon shredded several tanks and testing in front of a crowd of spectators. Those tanks were Soviet T-62s that America had acquired from Israel and M48 Patton III tanks. But by 1975, when the A-10A entered production, the newest Soviet tank was the T-72 with composite armor, and the T-64 tanks toting the same concept had been dropped in the 60s back when the program was still being conceived. They may still have thin roof and rear deck armor, but the A-10 comes in from low attack angles to avoid radar locks, so the A-10 wouldn't be able to hit that armor at any usable angle from a frontal pass. A tank just having composite armor means the A-10 has to cherry-pick its direction of attack. And speaking of cherry-picking, that reminds me of that tank shooting study from before that the Naval Postgraduate School did. The one thing that bothered me was that they only fired on the test M47s from the right side. There was no data suggesting the A-10 could even penetrate the basic rolled armor of the tank's front. So I decided to find out. I redid the A-10's gun test on the M47 in War Thunder from the front of the tank under roughly the same attack angles. If it can penetrate the front of the tank, it can penetrate anywhere else. And to make sure I could actually gauge how close War Thunder was to reality for this case, I also ran a control study by making a few additional runs also at the M47's right side. However, I can't make custom ammo belts in War Thunder, at least not yet, so the closest I could get to a full belt of DU armor-piercing rounds was 2 out of every 4. Also, counting the number of penetrating hits isn't exactly the most reliable or consistent means of extrapolating damage, so I relied on War Thunder's damage module system to tell me how close I got to scoring a catastrophic K kill, a firepower F kill, or a mobility M kill. In the control group side tests, I fired between 25 and 35 rounds for a total of 110 shells in 4 successful passes, and on only one of them did I almost get a catastrophic K kill. However, a full mobility or firepower kill was achieved 2 of the other times with 1 ineffective run with a lot of damage. So for the purposes of this video, I think War Thunder is at least close enough to reality to give us a better guess. So moment of truth. From the Patton II's front, I fired between 17 and 40 rounds per pass for a total of 295 shells in 10 successful passes. However, I only achieved a highly probable or certain mobility kill twice and a firepower kill once, with the vast majority of shells striking the forward armor plating on the hull and turret in each successful pass. And just for good measure, I even made a few unrestricted burst runs from the front, where I would just hold down the trigger on the M47's front armor as long as I was comfortable. 3 runs firing 90, 135, and 227 rounds. 2 firepower kills, 1 mobility kill. Not a single catastrophic kill from the front, even off of the mag dump. And while I wasn't recording firing distance like the test did, I feel like I probably got closer to my target than the test pilots. So if my test results are what I think they are, the A-10's gun effectiveness was probably a lot more limited than the original test results would imply. And so it at least feels to me that in practice, even against the adversaries it was made for, the gun is not the A-10's primary weapon. It's a backup for the missiles. And so with the A-10's primary capability in question and age piling up, it was only a matter of time before somebody finally tried to put the A-10 down for good. And by matter of time, I mean right from the beginning. The earliest the Air Force had tried to retire the A-10 was in 1984, right when its production run ended. Their first replacement idea was the modified F-16 they tried out in Desert Storm, but that failed. Of the 713 A-10s built, by the end of Desert Storm, the Air Force had 650 left. The most well-used 183 were placed in long-term storage in 1991, right after the operation ended. And by 1992, almost 250 A-10s had been phased out. However, the Air Force decided to actively maintain between 350 and 370 A-10s and upgrade them to keep them relevant. Problem, the A-10 was only designed for a life of 6,000 flight hours, which was later adjusted to 8,000 hours, and these began seeing fatigue and cracking problems in the wings as early as the late 1970s. With all the wear and tear from Desert Storm, the Air Force had literally been flying these things until they fell apart, in some cases literally running them into the ground. And by 2003, the A-10's life extension and maintenance costs were starting to add up, so they started considering cutting back on the extension program. But naturally, this was perceived on the other side of the aisle as retiring the A-10s, so they were kept around and the expenses were demanded.
You'll do what I tell you to do.
So they would initiate a re-winging program in 2007 to get new wings made by Boeing for 213 A-10s in the fleet, with only 145 done by 2013, and between then and 2014, 61 more were retired. With expenses mounting yet again, the Air Force decided to propose the full retirement of the fleet between 2015 and 2017. Unfortunately for them, though, it probably didn't help their case that a 2-star general and the vice commander of Air Combat Command went on a rant in front of 300 airmen that anybody who recommended that Congress keep the A-10s would be committing treason. He was caught, he was fired, and he was reprimanded, and after Congress refused the program, the GAO noted that the U.S. Air Force, quote, did not have quality information regarding the impact of the A-10's divestment on its force structure. And after a force structure study in 2016, they apparently still needed the A-10 and kept it. By 2018, there were 282 A-10s left, and Boeing had completely re-winged 19 more for a total of 164, with 9 more added by the end of 2019 for 173. But the A-10 fleet would continue deteriorating, and while there would be 281 planes left by 2020, 133 of those planes were in such bad condition that they could not be deployed.
We lost our chance as the one true gift that could be awarded men like us. A true, gloriful death.
As of right now, over 60% of the A-10 fleet cannot be deployed, and it's reported that many don't even have enough spare parts to keep the Avenger cannons up to date enough for them to be even fired. The Air Force has also been running out of parts and suppliers the entire time. I mean, Fairchild Republic ceased operations in 2003. The maintenance state was getting so bad that some Congress people were actually reconsidering keeping the A-10 around. The Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, which is pretty much a non-profit power struggle brainchild of Pierre Spray, claims that this is the result of the Air Force going on a starvation campaign to sabotage the continuation of the A-10 service life despite Spray's legacy. But considering the fact that emotionally written media is the most common method of manipulating public opinion in a written media piece, and the word choice in those articles are more emotionally dripping wet than newlyweds on a honeymoon, I don't buy it. Let me put it to you this way. The POGO articles genuinely praise Congress for rescuing the A-10.
Look at all those lines on your face.
And look at all the brown on your nose. How is the Pope doing?
And honestly, if I were trying to retire an aircraft that was too technologically obsolete for the era of combat that we're in, and being blueballed this hard by a group of people as broadly reputable for being slow and incompetent as Congress, I would probably enlist a similar strategy to get that shit out of my way so I can spend my money on things that'll come home in one piece instead of several.
I will not be cock-blocked to the point of entry, but a little blunt-toed!
So I'm really not surprised that even though the GAO and USAF were looking to replace the wings on 218 A-10s in 2022, they would still retire 21 more. They would only contract Boeing for 112 sets of wings, though, and they apparently had to fight Boeing just to get production lines back online in partnership with Korean Aerospace Industries, just to get the first 44 ordered. At the same time, the U.S. Air Force was still giving the A-10 more upgrades to keep them relevant per Congress's demands, upgrading its electronic warfare systems for countering new surface threats and adding GBU-39 small-diameter glide bomb racks. They even considered equipping them with miniature air-launched decoys, or MALDs, which are cruise missiles that replicate the radar signature of aircraft. And it's kind of funny because MALD is also a video game slang term for getting unreasonably angry. The Air Force was literally going to fill the air with so many fake airplanes that they'd make the enemy air defenders rage quit.
Cry about it, stay mad, get real, L mauled seed cope.
To my knowledge, the decoys probably didn't happen, most likely because the A-10s are too slow and would have to be on station before the strike package to time things, which would forecast an attack and alert the enemy. And while all this debate and congressional hassle was going on, the A-10 was getting older still. By the end of fiscal year 2023, 106 of all all A-10s ever flown had been written off due to crashes, killing 51 pilots and 7 other personnel through 107 Class A mishaps and 188 Class B mishaps, increasing to 112 write-offs by the end of 2024. That put the A-10s at a lifetime destruction rate of 2 A-10s lost to crashes a year and 1.8 A-10s lost per 100,000 flight hours. And now we get to today. The Pentagon proposed funding cuts in the 2026 defense budget that would retire the remaining 162 A-10s in the fleet by the end of the fiscal year, that being the 30th of June 2026, with Congress already pushing back to try and make them retain 103 of them. The Pentagon is aiming to free up funding for the F-15EX and a few extra F-35s, but their biggest reasoning is that it's just not suited to high-threat environments, which in light of the war in Ukraine have become a lot harder to figure out and plan for. Modern CAS is going to be a bit harder to achieve in that kind of environment against a near-peer adversary, especially thanks to things like man-portable air defense systems or man-pads like the American Stinger missile. The trees can literally speak and f*** you back to the A-10, and it won't always know where the words are coming from until it's too late.
They're in the trees!
For the best chance at surviving close air support, you generally have to know where your threats are coming from, whether that be the target you're attacking or other targets in the area, and have enough distance from them to react to the ones you don't know about. You don't really have that advantage against things like man-pads. The A-10 can definitely survive getting hit by a man-pad, which it has done in the past since its warhead is average at best, but pilots say these are the A-10's biggest pain in the ass, sometimes literally, because you have to find them visually. And I really don't want to find out how many licks it takes to get to the center of an A-10. You gotta remember, the A-10 wasn't made to fight over contested ground to the extent that could reasonably be expected. And even when it did fight in the more ideal conditions for it in Desert Storm, half the fleet sent to fight still got lit up to some extent. And in the battlefield of today, the weapon shot at it will most likely be more destructive. As I said before, the only thing better than getting shot and walking away is not getting shot. And not getting shot when everywhere you look on the ground has the possibility to reach out and touch you with a solar flare is more dependent on a medium amount of altitude and a solid amount of speed. Then of course there's the threat environment, and I'm going to try and outline that as best I can and hope it sticks. Buckle up.
And go.
The A-10 was designed from the ground up to fight in a threat environment where the enemy was invading an area where the US was defending, meaning the enemy would not have an integrated air defense network. This meant the majority of air defenses the A-10 was made to encounter were the ones that could move up with an armor column, such as the Shulka self-propelled anti-aircraft gun with the 23mm cannons the titanium bathtub was specifically designed to stop. It was not made to fight in offensive operations, where American forces enter enemy-held territory with large numbers of integrated air defenses covering wide swaths of airspace. And after the threat of a Soviet armor invasion disappeared, because, you know, the Soviets did, the US has not once fought in a combat environment where they were playing defense, and it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon, not even with Russia being a bitch in the backyard. And thanks to things like mobile SAMs, mobile radar stations, and man-pads now being fully in service across the entire world, even an invading force can set up that kind of air defense network on the fly. And you probably won't even know where a third of it is because it moves around on foot and can hit you from multiple sides at once with zero warning, as you can tell by some of the ejection footage from Ukraine. And the bigger, more expensive missiles like the ones the US has will prioritize the cockpit over the rest of the plane. And it's probably not going to be forever until another country figures out how to do that too, assuming they haven't already. And that titanium bathtub's gonna be real helpful against missiles coming at you through the canopy glass. I mean, at that point, the reason they're gonna call it a titanium bathtub is because that's what carries what's left of you after you've been liquefied. Now, the Pogo tries to go on and say the A-10 won't have to deal with this because suppression of enemy air defenses assets, quote, protect their supporting air units as a matter of routine, end quote, which is something that I find really funny, that they operate on a general stance of the military being incompetent and corrupt, but can still assume that their technology does what it's supposed to do 100% of the time. You remember that one time the F-16 dodged 6 missiles at once? Yeah, there was definitely a routine ending to the seed mission that was supposed to clear all that out first.
What happened here? Nothing at all.
There's also the consideration that the A-10 was only as useful as it was in Desert Storm because a lot of the fighting took place over wide open tracts of land. A naval battlefield like the South China Sea or even a less even land battlefield would present different target and threat types that the A-10 might not be as well optimized to handle. There are no land features for you to terrain mask against in the middle of the open ocean, and difficult terrain can force low and slow CAS aircraft to come in from specific angles that can be used against it. For example, in a conflict in the Pacific, the A-10s would also have to take off from faraway island bases rather than forward airfields. And the downside of a plane made to go low and slow from forward air bases in an environment where you cannot build a forward air base is that low and slow takes hours to even reach the battlefield just so it can provide CAS at all. The one time they did those anti-radar deep strike missions in Desert Storm, it wasn't uncommon for them to take between 8 and 10 hours round trip. That is 4 hours one-way minimum. By that point in a CAS mission, everyone you'd want to save is probably going to either be dead, captured, or saved by somebody faster. Plus, those missions it flew at the beginning of Desert Storm against artillery and even the radars were done out of necessity, not capability. Planners had intended to save the A-10 for the ground phase because of its CAS role focus, but had to employ it because of a shortage of those other aircraft. And while the A-10 does have the range to make those long radar strike missions, it would burn through most of the fuel they'd need to actually maintain their 2-hour loiter time, decreasing the value they were explicitly designed to bring to the table. The plot synopsis is that the A-10 was made for a smaller land battlefield that was dominated by armor and supported by missiles, not a larger, potentially naval one dominated by missiles and supported by armor. And those aren't the wars we're fighting anymore.
There's no room for gunslingers anymore.
But the A-10 will need a replacement because the CAS role can't simply be abandoned. There are also benefits to having an aircraft that's cheap and easy to fix in the field. And even if a gun can't be an effective tank-killing weapon anymore, a medium to high caliber autocannon is still valuable for taking out infantry and lightly armored targets, along with providing covering fire for search and rescue missions. And while a 20mm cannon like the Vulcan might be too light, a 30mm cannon might not be necessary. So I think I understand why the Air Force gave the F-35 its 25mm gun right in the middle. An A-10 replacement will also still need to be capable of flying slower to aim, and having a solid enough fuel capacity to stick around for at least a few runs, plus a lot of hard points to put bombs and the like. And I don't think I'd be doing my due diligence if I didn't at least have a temporary replacement suggestion in mind. But I want to make sure I have all my ducks in a row before I say it out loud, so that'll have to wait a few weeks. The A-10 has lived a long life, but if nobody's willing to give it an F-15EX style tech refresh, I think it might be time to take it out back like George from Of Mice and Men.
It's sort of like putting down old space yella.
So in summation, the A-10 doesn't appear likely to see any more combat. But if you somehow do see a Warthog on your radar scope, you better get your act together quick because somebody probably knows what they're doing with it. And it's either gonna fill your skies with enough fake airplanes to make you think hellfire is about to rain on you, or it's gonna fill your country with so many holes you won't have anywhere left to bury whatever's left of you. I'd like to give a shout out to Commander Dart for helping me make the A-10 gun test possible, and thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. I will be taking a break this week, so the next video you see will be posted the week after that. So until that next time, dismissed.